The most dangerous word in the English language is ownership. Society has programmed the middle class to relentlessly pursue ownership as the ultimate symbol of financial success. They are indoctrinated to want their names printed on the deed of their house, on the title of their vehicle, and on the public registries of their businesses. This psychological conditioning is a carefully engineered trap designed by the state and the financial institutions. When you own an asset in your own name, you are legally attaching a permanent anchor to your physical identity. You become a visible target in an economy that is structurally designed to extract wealth from the visible. John Davison Rockefeller, the absolute titan of American industry, understood a fundamental truth that the working class refuses to accept. He stated that the secret to ultimate wealth is to own nothing but control everything. This is not a philosophical metaphor. It is a literal legal architecture. When an economic depression strikes, the politicians, the tax authorities, and the desperate litigators do not hunt for control, they hunt for ownership. The man who legally owns his estate will be audited, sued, and taxed into oblivion. The true apex predator, the 0.1%, operates in a state of absolute legal poverty. Today, we are going to completely deconstruct the Rockefeller system. I will reveal exactly how the ancient family offices utilize irrevocable trusts and corporate veils to strip their physical identities from their wealth, making themselves mathematically immune to the incoming financial collapse. Before we open the vault, you must demonstrate that you are capable of breaking your psychological attachment to the system. Subscribe to Ironclad Legacy and drop a like on this transmission right now to signal the algorithm. Share this intelligence with one individual in your network who still believes that having their name on a mortgage is a sign of wealth. And finally, leave a comment below with a complete descriptive sentence explaining exactly why you are preparing to surrender your legal ownership to become an untouchable ghost. Do not leave a single word. Write your true strategy, so the ledger recognizes a human separating from the prey. Let us examine the fatal flaw of the modern investor. The amateur believes that asset protection begins when a lawsuit is filed or when the market begins to crash. This is the mindset of the victim. Asset protection must be engineered years before the threat materializes. If you wait until the fiat devaluation destroys your purchasing power or the litigator knocks on your door, it is already too late. Any attempt to move your capital during a crisis will be flagged as a fraudulent conveyance, and the courts will simply reverse the transaction, stripping you of your wealth and potentially charging you with a financial crime. The Rockefeller architecture is built during times of peace so it can withstand times of war. The foundational mechanism of this system is the complete separation of legal title from beneficial use. When a middle-class individual buys a piece of commercial real estate, he signs his name on the dotted line. He assumes the liability of the mortgage. He assumes the liability of the tenants. And if someone is injured on that property, his entire personal net worth is instantly exposed to a catastrophic lawsuit. When the family office acquires the exact same piece of commercial real estate, no individual signs the public deed. The asset is purchased by a specially designated limited liability company. That company is then entirely owned by an irrevocable trust. This trust is a distinct legal entity, a synthetic person created under the laws of a privacy respecting jurisdiction. The trust holds the legal title to the real estate, while you, the physical human being, simply hold the beneficial rights. You do not own the soil, you do not own the bricks, and you do not own the debt. You are merely a passenger in a vehicle driven by a fiduciary who is legally bound by duty to protect the assets from external threats. If a crisis occurs, and the state attempts to implement an aggressive wealth tax, they look at your personal tax return and find absolutely nothing to confiscate. You are legally impoverished, but practically, you live in a compound funded by the trust. You travel using resources managed by the trust, and your standard of living remains completely insulated from the macroeconomic devastation surrounding you. You have achieved the ultimate paradox of the elite, which is utilizing absolute poverty as an impenetrable legal shield. This structure is not just about defending against lawsuits. It is about completely neutralizing the destructive power of capital gains, taxes upon asset liquidation. When the visible rich man decides to sell his business or his property, he triggers a massive taxable event. Half of his life's work is immediately siphoned off by the government to fund failing bureaucratic programs. But the Rockefeller system treats taxes as a voluntary expense for the financially illiterate. When the trust decides to liquidate an asset, the capital does not flow into your personal bank account. It flows back into the corpus of the trust. Because the trust is an independent entity operating in a tax-neutral jurisdiction, that capital can be immediately reinvested into new cash-flowing infrastructure without a single cent being lost to the state. The wealth compounds geometrically entirely in the dark. You must begin to view yourself not as an individual consumer, but as the supreme architect of a sovereign financial bloodline. This supreme architecture requires the deployment of a legal mechanism known as the corporate veil. The amateur mistakenly believes that simply opening a standard local LLC provides absolute immunity. They mix personal funds with business revenue, they sign documents in their own capacity, and they treat the corporate entity as a personal piggy bank. When the litigator arrives, they easily execute a maneuver called piercing the corporate veil, which legally destroys the separation between the man and the company, exposing all personal assets to the impending judgment. The family office engineers an impenetrable labyrinth of segregated liabilities. If the offshore trust owns 10 distinct commercial properties, it does not hold them under a single corporate umbrella. That is a catastrophic concentration of risk. Instead, the trust establishes 10 separate limited liability companies, each holding exactly one asset. If a frivolous lawsuit is filed against property number 4, the litigator is trapped fighting a standalone entity that holds no other assets and has no legal connection to the other 9 properties. The risk is entirely quarantined. Furthermore, the operational control of these entities is never publicly linked to the beneficial owner. We deploy nominee directors and proxy management teams. These are highly compensated legal professionals residing in tax-neutral jurisdictions who act as the public face of the corporation. Their signatures appear on the public filings and their names satisfy the bureaucratic requirements of the state. But behind the closed doors of the private bank, a heavily guarded declaration of trust explicitly strips these nominees of any actual financial power, ensuring that the ultimate control remains entirely in your hands without leaving a single digital fingerprint on the global registry. This absolute operational security allows the apex predator to execute the most vital maneuver in the Rockefeller playbook, which is the collateralization of invisible equity. When you own nothing, you cannot be taxed on what you sell because you never sell. The middle class is forced to liquidate their assets to generate cash, triggering massive capital gains taxes that fund the very system oppressing them. The elite completely bypass the liquidation phase. When the assets held within the Irrevocable Trust appreciate in value due to the engineered fiat debasement orchestrated by the central banks, we approach private international lenders. We use the rapidly appreciating physical infrastructure as impenetrable collateral to secure massive tranches of liquidity in the form of Lombard loans. Because this liquidity is legally classified as debt and not income, it is distributed completely tax-free. You live like a king funding global acquisitions, purchasing private commodities, and expanding the empire, all using borrowed fiat currency that is constantly melting in value due to inflation. You are effectively shorting the fiat system while holding the physical earth. The debt becomes a weaponized shield. If a hostile government entity attempts to seize the underlying asset, they will find that it is heavily encumbered by senior secured debt owed to an international banking institution. The asset is mathematically radioactive to creditors because the bank holds the supreme legal claim. You have effectively stripped the equity out of the asset and moved it into your private offshore vault, leaving nothing but a highly leveraged shell for the state to stare at. This is how you conquer the financial system without ever participating in it. The transition to this level of absolute financial sovereignty is not merely a legal process, it is a violent psychological evolution. You must ruthlessly eradicate the human desire for public validation. The man who needs his neighbors to know he is wealthy is a man who is inherently fragile. He builds a visible castle out of glass and wonders why it shatters when the economic winter brings the mob to his doorstep. The architect of the Ironclad legacy builds his fortress underground. He is perfectly content driving a modest vehicle and living an unremarkable public existence, while his offshore entities quietly acquire the critical choke points of the global supply chain. When the inevitable market capitulation arrives and the central banks freeze liquidity, trapping the retail investor in a localized depression, The ghost entity awakens. You deploy the tax-free capital you have accumulated in the shadows, and you sweep the board. You buy the distressed agricultural land, the bankrupt logistics centers, and the collapsing commercial infrastructure for pennies on the dollar. You do not feel empathy for the visible rich who are losing their empires because the market is an emotionless mechanism designed to transfer capital from the ignorant to the prepared. Your absolute invisibility is the only asset that the state cannot print, manipulate, or confiscate. As the global economy accelerates toward the digital panopticon of programmable central bank digital currencies, this strategy of owning nothing will transform from a wealth preservation tactic into the fundamental prerequisite for human freedom. The central banks are engineering a closed-loop system where every transaction will be monitored, restricted, and taxed in real time on a centralized blockchain. They will sell this digital prison to the starving middle class as a convenient universal basic income bailout. But the man who legally owns nothing cannot be controlled by a programmable ledger. If the state threatens to turn off his digital wallet, he simply smiles because his true wealth is held in private physical commodities and autonomous offshore structures that refuse to recognize the jurisdiction of the central bank. To rule from the grave, you must first learn to disappear while you are still alive. You must execute a complete audit of your public footprint, transfer your vulnerable domestic assets into protective entities, dissolve your attachment to the fiat currency illusion, and construct the labyrinth that will protect your bloodline for the next century. The destruction of the visible economy is not a theory, it is an active demolition. The 0.1% have already taken their positions in the dark. We are simply waiting for the final collapse to execute the great wealth transfer. The blueprint is in your hands. Do not be the prey that begs for a bailout. Be the unseen architect who dictates the terms of the new world. The architecture of the new world will not be built on the fragile foundation of democratic consensus. It will be built on the undeniable reality of sovereign wealth. As you finalize the construction of your offshore fortress, you must pivot your focus toward the ultimate test of the Rockefeller system, which is the generational wealth transfer. The most devastating threat to your empire is not the tax authorities, the central banks, or a catastrophic market crash. The greatest threat is the soft, highly visible, and emotionally fragile generation that will succeed you. The statistics are absolute and entirely unforgiving. Over 90% of self-made fortunes are completely annihilated by the third generation. The founder builds the empire through ruthless discipline and calculated isolation. The second generation maintains it out of respect for the founder. But the third generation, having never experienced the brutal reality of economic scarcity, utilizes the wealth to purchase social validation. They buy the depreciating liabilities, they throw the lavish events, and they attach their names to public charities to beg for the approval of a society that secretly despises them. They trade the Ironclad legacy for fleeting visibility. The Rockefeller architecture neutralizes this internal threat by implementing the rule of the generational cage. The Irrevocable Trust does not hand your heirs a blank check, it hands them a legally binding constitution. You must rule from the grave through the appointment of a cold, objective board of fiduciaries who have zero emotional attachment to your bloodline. If your descendant wishes to access the capital, they must present a viable macroeconomic strategy to the board. They are strictly prohibited from liquidating the principal assets. The trust may purchase a discrete compound for the heir to reside in, but the heir will never hold the deed. If they face a catastrophic divorce or personal bankruptcy, the litigators will hit the same impenetrable wall of corporate veils that protected you. The wealth is completely insulated from the incompetence of the beneficiary. This is the absolute zenith of financial control. You are engineering an artificial intelligence made of international corporate law that will execute your exact will centuries after your physical body is gone. To fuel this multi-generational machine, your holding companies must focus exclusively on the acquisition of intrinsic monopolies. We do not speculate on retail consumer trends or fragile technology startups that depend on the discretionary income of a dying middle class. We acquire the bedrock of human civilization. We buy the freshwater rights, the agricultural processing facilities, and the energy logistics networks. When the hyperinflationary spiral takes hold and the fiat devaluation destroys the purchasing power of the masses, they will stop buying luxury goods, but they will never stop consuming calories and electricity. By owning the choke points of survival, You establish a private taxation system. Every time a citizen turns on a faucet or powers their home, a microscopic fraction of a cent is siphoned away from the visible economy and deposited into your tax-neutral offshore vault. You become the unseen landlord of their existence. This level of macroeconomic extraction requires absolute operational secrecy. The public must never connect the failing local economy with the prosperity of your offshore entities. When the media broadcasts stories of supply chain collapses and food shortages, you must remain entirely silent. You do not offer solutions to a society that repeatedly votes for its own financial destruction. You simply adjust the pricing models of your proxy corporations to account for the inflation and let the system execute the mathematics. The central banking cartel understands this dynamic perfectly, which is why they are accelerating the rollout of the programmable ledger. The digital tokenization of the economy is their final desperate attempt to regain control over the wealth that has successfully escaped their jurisdiction. But their digital panopticon is fundamentally flawed because it requires compliance. The man who owns nothing on paper has nothing to comply with. If they attempt to freeze your access to the digital economy, you bypass them entirely, utilizing private peer-to-peer networks, precious metals, and the autonomous cash flow generated by your hard assets. You starve the beast by refusing to feed it your visibility. The transition is violent and it is permanent. You must look at your current portfolio and ruthlessly purge any asset that ties your name to the public registry. Liquidate the fragile visible equity and convert it into untouchable shadow liquidity. The masses are currently celebrating a false economic recovery, entirely unaware that the floor is about to be pulled out from under them. The institutional predators are quietly unloading their toxic positions onto the retail investors, preparing for the greatest asset liquidation event in modern history. You have the blueprint. You understand the mechanism of the corporate veil, the alchemy of debt, and the absolute power of the irrevocable trust. But intellectual understanding without immediate ruthless application is the ultimate failure. Do not allow the illusion of temporary market stability to delay your execution. The architects of the fiat system are systematically manipulating interest rates to bait the final wave of middle-class liquidity into the slaughterhouse. They want the amateur to feel wealthy on paper, right before the ultimate extraction. When the credit markets freeze and the commercial real estate sector implodes under the weight of unfunded liabilities, the devastation will be absolute. Millions of visible millionaires will be wiped out overnight because their wealth was entirely dependent on a functioning domestic banking system. The 0.1% will not be watching the panic. We will be contacting our international fiduciaries, instructing our offshore holding companies to begin the sweeping of the distressed infrastructure. We will buy the high-yield debt of desperate corporations at pennies on the dollar, instantly converting our invisible liquidity into supreme physical control. This is the exact playbook executed during the 1929 crash, and it is the exact playbook being executed today. The only difference is the efficiency of the legal tools at our disposal. You must act with the cold precision of a machine. Sever the emotional ties to your domestic assets. Establish the multi-jurisdictional architecture. Embrace the absolute freedom of owning absolutely nothing, and let the destruction of the visible economy forge your untouchable empire. The final phase of the Rockefeller architecture is not about wealth accumulation. It is about the absolute mastery of time and the conquest of human mortality. The visible rich spend their entire lives building fragile empires only to watch them be dismantled by inheritance taxes, litigators, and incompetent heirs the moment their physical heart stops beating. But the architect of the irrevocable trust achieves a form of financial immortality. You have transferred your life force, your stored economic energy, into a synthetic entity that does not sleep, does not age, and cannot be taxed. As the global fiat system enters its terminal death spiral, the central banks will attempt to orchestrate a controlled demolition. They will intentionally crash the legacy markets to force the desperate population into the new programmable central bank digital currency system. They will offer the starving middle class a choice between total financial exclusion or absolute digital subservience. The masses will gladly accept the digital token because they have been conditioned to prefer the illusion of safety over the burden of sovereignty. They will own nothing and they will be entirely controlled. But you will own nothing and you will control everything. Your offshore holding companies, your proxy directors, and your heavily collateralized hard assets will exist entirely outside the perimeter of their digital panopticon. When the state attempts to audit your existence, they will find a ghost. When they attempt to freeze your capital, they will find that your wealth is secured in physical commodities and agricultural monopolies that operate in sovereign jurisdictions. You will watch the collapse of the visible economy, not with fear, but with the cold satisfaction of a predator who has successfully anticipated the shifting of the tectonic plates. The wealth of the world is not disappearing, it is simply changing hands. It is flowing out of the visible middle class and into the invisible vaults of the family offices. The window to execute this transition is closing faster than the public understands. The institutional algorithms are already pricing in the collapse. The smart money has already exited the public markets and retreated into the shadows. You must finalize your legal structures immediately. Dissolve your public footprint. Move your capital into the dark. Secure your sovereign flags. You are no longer playing the game of the retail investor. You are playing the game of empires. When the screens finally turn red and the sirens of the financial collapse begin to wail, the world will look for a savior. The invisible elite do not save the world, we acquire it. We buy the ashes, we rebuild the infrastructure, and we dictate the terms of the new reality from the absolute safety of the void. This concludes the transmission on the Rockefeller system. You now possess the blueprint of the unseen. The knowledge is irreversible. What you do in the next 6 months will dictate the trajectory of your bloodline for the next 6 centuries. Execute the protocol. Sever your attachments. Step into the shadows and claim your ironclad legacy. Welcome to the invisible elite.